2022 Mecklenburg Board of County Commissioners swearing-in ceremony. I'm Dina Diorio, Mecklenburg County Manager and presiding officer for tonight's meeting until the election of a temporary chairperson. Members of the public may access and view the meeting at www.watch.mecnc.gov. Tonight's ceremony will proceed as outlined in your program. First, we will have an invocation by Chaplain Aileen Maddox from the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office. Following the invocation, we will have the presentation of colors, the Pledge of Allegiance, and then the singing of our national anthem and a musical selection by singer-songwriter Arsena. Following the musical selection, we will have the administering of the oaths of office provided by the Honorable Kimberly Y. Best, Superior Court Judge, 26th Judicial District of North Carolina. I will now call upon Chaplain Aileen Maddox for the invocation.
Good evening. Let us pray. Ancient of days, God of glory, the authoritative one, all authority lies in you. On this day, God, we welcome you in.
Discussion and then going into the committee report outs because we talked a lot about how do we develop what people wanted to accomplish with infrastructure and what would be the outcomes at the end of the day for as we were doing infrastructure discussions and having this meeting. So we're going to have that meeting on the 19th and it's going to be at 1 o'clock here in this room. I have to say that Councilmember Driggs and Manager Jones and I will be not able to attend because we're going to meet with the U.S. DOT's Deputy Assistant Secretary for about Build America Bureau, and it was something that was on the schedule, but it was really important for the infrastructure meeting to take place. So the Mayor Pro Tem will preside over that meeting on the 19th that we're having here. The goal of this meeting was to actually for us is to build the definition of what council, how they see infrastructure and what's necessary to accomplish. And so we'll have that discussion. Now, Ed and the manager and I will be in Washington, D.C., where we'll be getting a session on how the bipartisan infrastructure law will be dispersed and information about that. So we'll come back and let you know about the outcomes of that and the work that we're doing in terms of infrastructure specific to U.S. DOT. And then we'll learn about what you do on the 19th in terms of civic and municipal infrastructure for our own city. So tonight I thought we might start off with everyone, if the chairs are going to report on the infrastructure, that I would start off with Ms. Watlington to ask her if you're, for your committee's discussion out of our housing and safety or neighborhood improvement, all of those things about people being a part of it. But I think we probably ought to go around because I just noticed that we do have a camera here. So let's start with our city attorney for introductions so that they don't have to pull on your shirt individually. Mr. Baker.
Patrick Baker, city attorney.
Good evening. I'm Victoria Watlington, your Charlotte City Council member representing District 3.
Good evening, Dante Anderson, District 1.
Tara Bakari, District 6.
Ed Driggs, District 7.
Graham, District 2.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
My Lyles, Mayor.
Braxton Winston at large and serving as Mayor Pro Tem.
Good evening, LaWanna Mayfield, Council at Large.
Good evening, Renee Johnson, District 4.
Good evening, James Mitchell at large.
Good evening, Marjorie Molina, District 5.
Billy Johns, Deputy City Clerk.
All right, thank you. Ms. Watlington, if you'll kick off the infrastructure discussion for us.
Certainly, thank you. In the housing and Safety and Community Committee, we had a couple of key pieces that came out as infrastructure topics as input into the meeting related to those key areas. So from a housing standpoint, the housing location policy, rezonings and affordability bonuses, what's working, what's not, concentration of affordable housing, and then lastly, TOD and mixed income housing. So when we talk about infrastructure, the focus and the theme is really about how do we put the houses where the jobs are and where existing infrastructure is, and how do we as a city plan ahead, not only within our city limits, but regionally with our partners and neighbors nearby. I think that was one of the themes of the day in each committee meeting, was how do we move from just thinking about the city of Charlotte within our direct control into how do we contribute to the broader region as the nucleus of the MSA. From a safety standpoint, some of the things that came up immediately were lighting. Number one, we know that we have had an opportunity to improve our lighting maintenance across the city. Councilmember Mayfield noted a few of our areas, 277, Beatty's Ford. We know that Billy Graham also is another area that is in need of continued lighting maintenance. We know we've got a couple of projects ongoing addressing those areas, but that's one thing that as we think about infrastructure, we want to make sure that we are safely lighting areas, because we know that well-lit areas reduce not only fatalities with traffic, but also crime, which was another significant policy area that we want to look at as it relates to neighborhoods in particular. We want to talk about how housing is not just housing it's alone, but it's seen in the light of things like schools, like I said, crime and safety, walkability, stormwater. We know that more and more we're starting to see residents lift up concerns about how new developments near their neighborhoods are impacting their stormwater infrastructure. And then finally, from a community standpoint and also safety, we really, really want to take a look at what we can do to further incentivize a recruitment and retention of our medics, our CMPD officers, and our firefighters. And I would open it up to anyone else from the committee that might want to add something.
Thank you, Mayor. So Transportation Planning and Development, the members are myself as chair, Ms. Anderson as vice chair, and Mr. Graham, Ms. Johnson, and Mr. Mitchell as committee members. I think one thing that was apparent from our conversation is that a clear separation of this topic among the committees is very hard. There's a lot of crossover, and I think we're all mindful of this kind of integrated idea we have for basically improving our city and making our city a great place. We talked about meeting format, and the point was made that we need to be clear that we are just starting a process here, that we're not going to solve the whole thing, and I think Mr. Graham in particular was very clear about that. We suggested that we should have opportunity for council discussion rather than necessarily hearing a lot of presentations. So it really needs to be about the opportunity for us to come together. And one recommendation that was made was that we might have a facilitator in order to make sure that we have structure in the conversation. On the subject of transportation, one of our members suggested that we needed more information about city versus state-maintained roads, because we're constantly being challenged about state-maintained roads. People don't know the difference. We did talk about the need for a regional transportation strategy, and I mentioned in particular that Connect Beyond is exactly the way we're going about that. We have to look at a regional approach and start policy work with Connect Beyond, and recognize too that federal funding depends on that. So this is not just a sort of desirable thing for us, but I think it's a critical condition for funding. On growth and planning, the question was, how do we grow smart and have less impact on our residents? So how can we manage our growth to achieve our purposes and avoid the negative implications? And I think that was the driver behind this whole process, is that we are increasingly finding that our pursuit of density and more housing is leading to louder and louder objections about the congestion and traffic conditions in these locations. So how can we be a little bit more mindful about that? How can we measure the impact of rezoning and look at cumulative traffic impacts from pending development? I will say personally, I think our metrics for assessing traffic are sometimes hard for people to understand, because you're in an environment like Providence Road in my district where there's a whole bunch of different things going on, and it's not clear that we're thinking cumulatively about the effect of them. So we might want to look harder at how we measure the traffic and the cumulative effects. What are the existing constraints in the system? Water, sewer, stormwater, transportation, and we did talk about water, sewer, as well as transportation and stormwater. Those are enterprise funds, so we would need to study more carefully their existing framework for capital investment, system maintenance, and growth, the investment plans they have, and understand that if we get more aggressive in terms of how they grow, that will probably have implications in terms of the rates we have to charge, because they are self-funded. And then include the 2040 plan in the conversation to ensure that all council is familiar with it and we are not reinventing anything that we've already discussed. So priorities as a subject. Recognize that we have conflicting priorities, and how do we reconcile those? So social justice, equity, economic development, environment, quality of life questions, sometimes these goals work at cross purposes. And the example I like to use is trees and housing, sidewalks. So let's be more apparent about, or upfront about recognizing that we are going to have to make choices and think about what those are. How do we apply priorities to projects and identify sequence? So we know about 200 projects that were identified recently in a presentation we got. Water and stormwater have their own pipeline of capital projects and so on. And so should council try to communicate more clearly what our priorities mean in terms of the order in which we tackle those things? Mobility priorities, safety, growth, equity, how do we prioritize these against each other? Once again, reconciling. We did talk about funding as well, and I think one thing that was apparent from the presentation we got is that our CIP capacity is really very small in relation to all the things we want to do, and Mr. Bakari, I think you pointed that out very plainly in our meeting. So we are talking about another source, and obviously the one we've identified is the sales tax for the Transformational Mobility Network, but I think we need to be clear about what plans we make that depend on the realization of the mobility network and the sales tax, and what we can really achieve with the CIP. But the truth is, when you look at some of the allocations we saw in our bond cycles and how small they are in relation to the need, we're going to need something bigger in order to really make a dent in these infrastructure issues. And I think that's it. Then maximize the federal funding, which again would require that we have a regional transportation plan and exhaust all opportunities to get funds from state and federal sources. That's it.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if any member of the committee would like to add anything. I hope I got it all. Thank you.
Okay,
Thanks.
thank you. Ms. Ajmira, we're talking about the infrastructure portion of what your committee discussion was. If you could tell us just in this area, and then we're going to come back for committee reports later.
Sure. So, thank you, Madam Mayor. Before I give my committee report, I just wanted to echo what Mr. Drake said about infrastructure. It's a very large issue, and the CIP is just a drop in the ocean. So, whatever we do through CIP will not address even 10% of the billion-dollar problem that we have. So that's where sales tax increase comes in play, and that's where the intergovernmental lens is so critical, because we can't really do that without the support from the federal and state legislators. In fact, our committee discussed the intergovernmental lens to infrastructure investments. And so I'll just walk you through what our committee had discussed. There was consensus among the committee members to bring a facilitator for December 16th meeting. December 19th meeting. Also, Ms. Mayfield brought up a great point about having visuals and maps on key infrastructure investments that's been made in last 5 years, throughout the city, and also the infrastructure investments that are planned for the future. That I think committee agreed on that we do need that information. Also, the need to come up with metrics and plan to measure things. So on December 19th, when we meet, we need to have clear objectives, that here are the things we are going to tackle, and have clear goals for that meeting. And then we also talked about taking a deeper dive into the bipartisan infrastructure law and see how we can tap into some of that federal funds that are available. And Mr. Mitchell had raised a good point about prioritizing within the CIP. I did bring this up earlier, where CIP is just a drop in the ocean. However, we do need to prioritize where we have very immediate needs that can be addressed while we continue to work on sort of sales tax increase. So prioritizing CIP and how it's spent would be a key. And viewing infrastructure through the equity framework. So we have discussed equity and governance framework, and it was approved by the majority of the council. So we gotta look at how some of these investments are being made, and how, especially in the communities that have been underserved. And what else? So, and then also, Mr. Bukhari had brought up this a need to define sub-buckets under infrastructure and create a measurable roadmap. He was referring to planning and understanding strategies in investments as it relates to stormwater, mobility, transportation, school capacity, greenway, and the environment. And there was one item that was mentioned by one of the committee members, where oftentimes council gets approached about everything to do with infrastructure, but there needs to be a clear understanding and helping public understand the clear difference between the infrastructure investments that are made by the city versus by the state. And I know that question often comes up in Ms. Johnson's district, where there are a lot of state maintained roads, and even in Ms. Watlington's district. So we need to have that clear distinction, and then also probably advocate for those as we finalize our federal and state legislative agenda items. So that's in a nutshell, but committee members, feel free to jump in if I missed anything here. That's just my notes. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. All right, and then we'll go to Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The Economic Development Committee met, and we also had our discussion on infrastructure. We acknowledged the email that the Mayor Pro Tem sent as a guide, and so we acknowledged that work that he and others did, and obviously we looked at this from an economic development perspective, big picture. And I started off the conversation talking about the infrastructure at Charlotte Douglas International Airport, right? It's the facility that powers the region, and certainly what we're doing there in terms of infrastructure investment, although it's an enterprise division, is really important, not only for the city of Charlotte, but for the region. So we just acknowledge that regional economic development generator and the work that the folks at the airport is doing, keeping in line with that regional perspective. We did talk, Councilmember Wallington and I, about the regional approach to this from an economic development perspective. And as we go out to shop economic development projects for the city, that we really also do it through a regional lens to make sure that we are working in conjunction with the 13 counties surrounding us, and that they are a part of our economic development discussion. as the city grows and matures, it's just not Charlotte, it's the Charlotte region now, and so we acknowledge some of those items. Infrastructure, incentives for directing growth in a certain area, site selection for when companies are looking at this, the Charlotte area, the conversation about TIGs, the budget, and also legislative agenda items as well. Even discuss briefly a transportation authority, right? So all those regional things that we have to do to make sure that as the city grows and our infrastructure needs stretched, that we're working with regional partners. We couldn't talk about infrastructure from an economic development perspective without acknowledging the work that Ed is doing in the Transportation Committee, and so we concur with him in terms of the importance of Connect Beyond, the importance of the mobility plan that we just received last week. I threw in the importance of farm to market roads. These small towns, these two-lane highways, they all need to be widened. That's really, really important for us as well. And so we acknowledge the importance and the relationship between transportation and economic development and how we kind of work together. All that, again, is also a regional approach in terms of where we go. And then we ask a basic question: where is the growth then, and what are the challenges, and identifying the hot spots in the city. And based on the number of rezonings that come across our desk over the last 19 months, you know, District 3, District 2, District 7 is really where all these rezonings are coming from. And so making sure that we identify what I call hot spots in those districts or those areas of town to ensure that we are addressing infrastructure needs in those particular communities. We also understand that, and we agree with Councilmember Mayfield, that we should identify projects that are currently on the books, planned and ready to go, that may address some of these infrastructure needs currently. We said 2 to 3 years, but 5 years out may also be very appropriate as well. We also acknowledge the need that this is a big budget item, right? And we're going to need federal support. So I'm glad to hear that the mayor and others are going to DC to find out where those infrastructure dollars are flowing and where it's going, and how we can get some of those dollars for projects here in the Charlotte region. And also we concur that NCDOT plays an extremely important role in terms of identifying infrastructure relief on roads that are currently owned and operated by the states. And then lastly, some of the obvious that we talked about, the impact on Charlotte water, the impact on Charlotte sanitation, the impact on Charlotte fire, the impact on Charlotte police, all those things on a monthly basis when we do rezonings, all those city departments are impacted directly. And so making sure that from a budgetary perspective that we're just keeping up with the growth with these basic departments in terms of projects, staffing, et cetera. And then lastly, and you know, I wouldn't be the economic development chair if I didn't say this, we can't stop the growth and we can't stop development, right? So we got to find a way to manage our growth and to work to control it as much as we can, right? And so development is one of the reasons why we hadn't raised taxes in, what, 6 years? 6 years. And so we got to find a way to identify where our pain points are, and then more importantly, how do we pay for it? So that's in a nutshell our conversation. So if anyone from the committee wants to chime in, they can do so at this point.
So much that we've got in common across all of the committee discussions. The example of, you know, we recognize that we're the center of a region that's growing, and that we have to build relationships in state and federal, and I would even say county, now that they're working with affordable housing and building some things out, or where their facilities are. We have to remember greenways are in the county's purview. So again, something like that is really important. I heard a sense of urgency, that it's not just what we can do in the CIP, but a sense of urgency of being able to fund and move forward on something that was large, and metrics, meaning that when I say metrics, generally what I believe people are saying is that we can tell people what we're going to do and be able to report out whether or not we've done it. And I know that the urgency of projects that are here and now, as well as those that we have in the future, and the purpose of some of our projects, whether they are to serve or develop opportunities or to address past discrepancies, are all there. So I think you guys have hit this. The question's going to be, in this discussion, how do you frame that and what's most important? I don't think it's a one-time discussion, obviously. And I had asked the Mayor Pro Tem, Mr. Bakari, and Ms. Johnson to actually give some thought to this in terms of the agenda. I mean, really, if there's going to be a facilitator, someone has to choose the facilitator. If there's going to be pre-reads as recommended and suggested with maps and outlines, this is major and big. How do you get it to something that you can talk about? And I think that the three council members would be able, and the Mayor Pro Tem would be able to help accomplish that. So I'm going to recognize the manager, and then I read the city attorney's memo, so we'll start with Ms. Watlington and come around and have everyone have an opportunity to speak. Mr. Jones.
Okay, so I'm speaking to the committee reports out just now?
Just for infrastructure.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No, not at all. So let me tell you what I think I heard. And what I'd like to do is just talk about some opportunities over the course of the next 4 months, okay? So you do have the infrastructure meeting that's on the 19th. You have the Jobs and Housing Summit that's on January 9th and 10th. You have 3 budget workshops, one in February, one in March, one in April. And then there was a discussion about potentially having a retreat in January. So instead of having to fight, I guess, what does it say? Take the elephant one, whatever it is. Yeah, there are some opportunities here. And so what I heard is, having pre-reads, which to me, certain things like the state of infrastructure, water, sewer, transportation, I think would be helpful. Visual maps, some of the things that we've seen over the course of the last 5 years in terms of growth. I really like the way that Council Member Watlington started off. It's, where are the jobs and, how do we plan ahead? So maybe there's some information from an economist, what they're seeing in the area. I believe we had those pre-reads as well as a facilitator, that we would be able to have the council have a good conversation around infrastructure for that 19th, knowing that there's still some additional opportunities to discuss other aspects of this, either through a budget workshop, if we're talking about lighting or things of that nature. But that's just starting off to maybe do a bit of a platform that can be built on.
Phil, none? Ms. Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just believe great input through all of the committees today. We're not going to get this done in one meeting, but I'm hopeful that if we walk into the 19th with a structure and desired outcomes outlined going in, I think that's so critical for us to articulate what our desired outcomes are before we even start the meeting. So that will set us up for success on a go-forward basis with these touch points that we have together in Jan and February. So that's the only piece that I didn't hear here. We discussed it earlier, but I think we need to specifically outline what our desired outcome is. Thank you.
Mr. Bakari, do you want to respond to specific outcomes?
I think
Do you want
Mr.
any
Winston
comments
does.
generally?
I think Mr. Winston is teed up for that.
Okay, do you have any other comments?
What? I'm just not sure what we're doing right now, so,
Well,
none yet.
I want to make sure everybody had an opportunity to speak, so you don't have to. Mr. Driggs?
So I would just say at a high level that I think there will be a lot of attention paid to our process because this is a sore subject in the community. I think we have the appearance right now of proceeding with our plan and allowing development to proceed without regard to impact, local impact. So I would hope for this meeting that we go in and come out with something that gives people hope, that makes them think that we're taking this seriously and that they have reason to be hopeful that there's going to be relief on some of these issues, congestion issues and so on. Because we have in our 2040 plan, we placed the emphasis on density and accommodating growth in such a way that we could keep costs down. And maybe we didn't talk enough about infrastructure then. So this is our opportunity to do that. I just hope that when we're done, people in the community will feel better about our concern with these congestion and other issues. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with Councilmember Anderson. I think the end is in the beginning, right? We got to know how we want to land this thing. I also agree with the Mayor Pro Tem in terms of a narrowly tailored conversation that we give staff clear direction in terms of where we want to land this plane and move forward. It's a worthy conversation, not only a conversation, it's a worthy exercise that I believe that the council should undertake. Not knowing that we're not going to solve anything on the 19th other than to level set and make sure that we all kind of know where we're going, how we're going to get there, how long it's going to take, you know, what resources that we need, et cetera. So I hope that there's some patience around the table in terms of the process that we're going to take. But I'm committed to walking through it. I think it's a worthy undertaking that we have to take. I like the way the manager has set it up, that it corresponds with some of our budget discussions, because a lot of these things are budgetary in nature that we may resolve. But it's a big ticket item, and so a lot of the heavy lifting will be coming, I believe, out of DC and the state, and certainly those things that we can do within our purview, within our local budget. But it's this exercise is a marathon, and I hope that we have the patience to kind of see it through and not thinking that we're going to solve issues on the 19th or even in January, but that we set the framework. And as Councilmember Anderson indicated, that the end is in the beginning. So let's make sure that we know exactly which road we're going to choose and how. And I think that's really important. Thank you.
He thought he would be recognized to speak first and have a plan outline. I am sorry that we hadn't had a chance to talk today, so I did not have a confirmation of that. So I'm going to just ask, I know that Ms. Johnson's working with you as well as Mr. Bakari, but if you would just allow the three other council members that may have any specific areas to talk, and then I'll turn it over to the three of you. All right? Ms. Ajmer, anything specific?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I agree with Ms. Anderson. We do need to have clear objectives, and that was one of our committee's feedback, is to have clear objectives as we go into this December 19th meeting and have clear metrics, right? What does success look like to this council from infrastructure perspective? And from what I hear, there seems to be consensus among having additional workshops, especially on the budget. And Ryan, I'm looking at you on infrastructure focused, including the CIP. CIP just plays a very small part in that, but I think overall, Mr. Graham is right. There are, at the end of the day, funding is what we need to figure out for all of this. So we will need to have budget-specific workshops on these items as we move into our budget season. And that's all I have.
All right. Ms. Mayfield, did you have any comments? All right. Mr. Mitchell?
Thank you, Mayor. I think our colleagues have made outstanding comments. I'm just going to leave us with one word, though. I want us to be intentional. As we start this work on December 19th, we need to be committed and make sure we're intentional as we move along, particularly if we can set some short milestones. City Manager, I think you did a great job of breaking out kind of the check-in points. You know, our strategy retreat, budget workshops in February, And Councilman Driggs, I think you're right. If we can show the citizens we intentional, we're committed, I think it'll be a goodwill that we finally now starting to sit down and have a conversation about infrastructure. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And so, as we all know, council decided to have this infrastructure meeting in December. And in conversations with staff, in conversations with other council members, and with conversations with community members who have been really kind of attuned to this decision to have this meeting, you know, everybody has been at a consensus that they want to know what this is and what can they expect when this meeting happens on the 19th. And that obviously is something that has been echoed around the table. So Mr. Bakari, Ms. Johnson, and I have worked on this kind of guiding document that was used to have a similar or the same conversation across policy area paths. And our intent really is to set staff up for success over these next few days, so they're able to set up a meeting that is appropriate to council's wants and desires, and as I said, provides outcomes for and acts as a starting point for a policy pathway and a further policy discussion, whatever that may mean. But I think in order to do that, in order to set staff up for certain success, we have to answer some questions tonight. First of all, how are we going to go about this meeting? Should this be a facilitated discussion between staff and council, as it was suggested earlier today in a couple different committees? If not, what should it look like? Who should be part of this discussion? Is this something that is just staff, is just staff and council talking to one another? Some folks have suggested that we should invite partners in our different policy areas. For instance, you know, I think about, again, I'm just going to pull examples from each kind of committee area, you know, from planning lens. Do we invite the development community? From an econ development lens, do we invite the Business Alliance or CRVA? From a housing and safety perspective, do we invite community organizations or neighborhood organizations? From an intergovernmental standpoint, do we invite different representatives from local governments or our lobbyists? If we invite them, is this something that we want them, a conversation that we want them to participate in, or do we just think that it's important that they're in the audience? And then, of course, what should be on the agenda? We have all here thrown out a lot of topics that we all think are important, but we're not going to be able to deal with everything in one meeting, in a 2-hour meeting. But there were some overlaps, you know, that were referred to in different in the 4 different meetings today. I think we can answer those questions and rely on this document that Ms. Johnson, Mr. Bakari, and I kind of put together to help us figure this out. But I think we also need feedback from staff. Do you have the sufficient, after we have this conversation, do you have the sufficient guidance from us? Or do you need more details in any of the specific areas to make the 2 hours that we spend together in a couple weeks really effective? So, again, I would really start with how should this meeting go? Should this, Mr. Mitchell really put it out there. I thought it was a great idea that it should be a facilitated discussion. We need somebody that helps us translate between each other, because sometimes staff's perspective doesn't get translated right right to council and vice versa. So we need to make sure that we're on the same page first and foremost. How do we get there? I think that's needs to be, I think we need counsel from colleagues to determine which direction we should go.
So I heard that a facilitated
Madam Mayor, I was just going to ask, would you like for us to vote on the first item, the Mayor Pro Tem, or just a nod of heads?
I don't think you have to vote to have a facilitated meeting. I think the biggest question is who facilitates, and someone needs to think about what the criteria is for someone that is going to facilitate and having someone that does it well or addresses that. So I would say no vote required if this is a discussion here now, so we can go and go to continue. So I'm going to say facilitated meeting, yes, and.
Got it.
Okay? All right, Mr. Mayor Pro Tem.
But, and so to your point, I think the facilitator what facilitator you pick might depend on, again, who is at this meeting, right? Who is participating? Is this just staff and council, or do we think we need other partners at this table? Because that is something that we have heard from council, not just today, but in past conversations around infrastructure.
The next, I think you said a facilitated meeting, and we're saying yes. So the next one that you mentioned, is it council and staff, or is it council, staff, partners?
Who is part of this meeting?
Right, okay. Any ideas or thoughts on that? Mr. Graham?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I think until we know where we're going, I would feel a little bit uncomfortable inviting others around the table until we set a clear direction until where we're going. I agree that the infrastructure discussion should include those who impacted, right? And so I don't have any problem with that. I just want to make sure that when we take off, we know where we're going, and so that we won't bring any additional confusion to the conversation until we kind of know exactly where we're headed.
Okay, Ms. Watlington?
I would say, though, there are some obvious partners like CARTPO and other folks like that. Is this discussion around?
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
I said there are some obvious partners like CARTPO and others that are like looking at this from a regional standpoint. Are we talking about whether we want to invite people beyond the kind of usual suspects?
Well, I don't know who the usual suspects would be for this meeting. And I think that's, again, what we need to define tonight. Who?
Because to me, if we keep talking about this regional piece, there's some folks that we already know. Like, we know that CRTPO, we know that Council of Governments, we know there are certain bodies that exist that are trying to look at an overall planning situation. I mean, I think that the Alliance might be an obvious partner as we talk about the planning economic development strategies and employment centers around the region. I mean, shoot, the railroad, for instance, may be, someone from the Railroad Board may be an obvious partner. I think that there are some things that we can hash out that makes pretty good sense, because a lot of those plans are already somewhere in development, but may not necessarily be as visible. I don't think that we should go about it trying to have an infrastructure conversation, recognizing that we're a regional kind of center without having some of those partners at the table.
Okay, Mr. Driggs and Ms. Johnson.
I think in a 2-hour span, we have our work cut out for us as a council to clarify, try to establish a consensus on the subject of infrastructure. And my concern would be if we start inviting other people, we're just not going to have time. I mean, it's very hard to take on board. And also, I think it was Mr. Graham, but I think we can get to a place in 2 hours as a council where then the stage is set for more in-depth meetings with various subject matter experts or stakeholders. But if we attempt too much in that short time frame, I think we're going to come away empty. The thing I like about the facilitator is that it might help us to have a structured conversation and to have some takeaway from it. Like they might help us to get to the point where we can actually say, this is what happened as a result of these 2 hours.
My question, I would have a follow-up.
Ms. Johnson asked to be recognized next.
Thank you. First of all, I don't know when we restricted it to 2 hours. Right.
Well, we sent it out in the memo, and I didn't get any feedback that it would be, but this is a meeting that's very important, and you own it, so
Right.
you can go further, you can do more if you have agreement that that's what you want to do.
I mean, I guess that would be up to council, but I'm just hearing 2 hours today. And so I don't know what the other, I don't know what the other colleagues thought, but, so, I agree with Mr. Driggs. Yes, this is a regional issue, but I think there are enough issues locally that we as council need to sit down and discuss first. And one of the things when we were meeting that Mr. Bakari said, anything that's discussed during zoning is fair game. We should not be waiting until our zoning meetings to discuss these issues. And my proposal for this meeting was just so that we're looking at the growth of the city in a comprehensive way. And this should not be a novel idea, as explosive as the growth is in the city. I almost see it like if you go to a restaurant, if you can't afford the tip, don't go to the restaurant. So if we can't address the consequence of growth, then we need to slow down the growth. I think it's, we as council do have that ability. If we do that or not, then that's a different issue. But to say that we can't stop the growth or the development is just not true. Growth. We have the 2040 plan. We have all these plans for the 88 new people that are moving here per day, but there are residents that are here that are hurting. That we hear it every month at the zoning meetings, the traffic, the safety. The schools are overcrowded, and then we would say that schools aren't under our purview, yet we know that children in failing schools, it's difficult to move up to be upwardly mobile. So it's all interconnected, and I think that it's okay that we take an afternoon to talk about it. This won't be the last meeting, but it should be the first. And we should just really, we should be intentional about strategic and responsible and balanced growth. So what I would say, I'd like to see a facilitator. I'd like to see a facilitator from the MWBE list. There's some leadership coaches. Maybe we take a look at some coaches from that group. I think that this would be a great opportunity. So I'd like to see the facilitation, and if we need to meet with Mr. Jones afterwards and talk about the agenda and everything, we can do that as well if the council will trust us to move forward with that. Thank you.
All right, Mr.
Well, I think we do need to, the logistics of a meeting, especially if we want to invite people, we want to facilitate it. We have a zoning meeting later that day. So we do have to set some parameters about what we want to achieve. I have a follow-up question for Mr. Driggs. Mr. Driggs suggested that we should come to consensus around infrastructure as a council. That sounds like an outcome, but that sounds like a broad outcome. I wonder if there is some way that we can tailor that, because I doubt we would come to a broad consensus on everything. And again, we, in consult with Ms. Johnson and Mr. Bakari, we really saw that the 19th as the start of a policy discussion that would kind of move forward. So perhaps a consensus around how that future policy discussion would go, but I don't want to put words in Mr. Driggs' mouth.
Mayor, may I respond?
Please.
I just want to be clear, the way I look at this, we don't need to reinvent the 2040 plan, right? I mean, we just spent years thinking about the future of the city and the direction we want to go and addressing a lot of these issues. So what we're talking about right now is whether we have adequately addressed the implications of our growth priority in the 2040 plan, creation of housing, liberalizing land use, if we have adequately addressed infrastructure. And when I said consensus, call it clarity. All I'm trying to say here is I think we need to talk to each other and reach a point where we have as shared as possible an opinion about what this whole topic means, infrastructure. What are you talking about here, right? It comes down to, again, I think, acknowledging that one of those conflicts or tensions in our 2040 plan is that as we encourage developers to offer us more housing and bigger buildings and so on, we're creating a lot of problems on the ground. We are deficient already in terms of our infrastructure capacity in a lot of areas. We want to transition away from cars, but it will take time. And so I think we can do more than we have done, but I don't want to go back and start kind of reinventing everything that we did, because we have a lot invested in our 2040 plan already. So I hope that's clear. It's just about clarity, right? I mean, if you ask everybody around the room what it means to them, you might get 11 different answers. We need to try and harmonize that a bit.
Okay. Ms. Anderson?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I'm just going to throw out some ideas. I think that this meeting is really the jump start of a variety of conversations. And one approach might be, we have a subset of topics that we've laid out a bit earlier. One approach might be that we have a facilitator who is knowledgeable in design thinking, right? And we're running like a design workshop who can help us prioritize this subset of list and how we would go about attacking those, understanding that there's some interconnectivity between several of them, of course, but if we have a facilitator who can help us prioritize and identify interconnectivity, then what we could come out of this meeting with is a list that we have a action plan of how we're going to address it and begin identifying ways in which we can address it, such as additional funding sources, partnering with regional, state, and other municipal parties. But I think we need to have a way to attack this first before we invite other voices into the conversation. Because if we invite other voices into the conversation at the very first meeting, then I don't think we're going to be successful in getting a structure. We'll be very successful in having ideas out there. So we need to land on a structure, feel like we all feel relatively good about the plan of attack, and then we introduce other voices that we want to lean on for subject matter experts, points of view, people who can help us. So that's just my suggestion of how we could potentially execute the meeting.
Thank you. I wanted to say that I think that there's been a lot of truth in everything that people have commented on, the differences. Somebody's got to pull this together in a way that has an outcome that people agree with. And I know how difficult that is. And I'm not quite sure that right now we can land on something that immediate to say, what I've heard people say is that council and staff need to work together with a facilitated discussion that extends beyond the 2 hours. The zoning meeting starts at 4, so you can go until 3 or 3:30, and then, have the zoning meeting at 4. So I think that that's one way to do it, but it is the beginning, because infrastructure is a topic that what are you going to connect? What do you even define as your infrastructure? And then how do you define your priorities within infrastructure? How do you look at the way that we approach it? Is there something that's different? And honestly, our city in the past has approached it as an economic development tool. I think there's something to be said for what we'd like to see it done, how it would be done differently, and if it should be done differently, how. But I think even just getting It may not be the idea of coming to a common consensus about where it's going, but even just a definition of what infrastructure is, because infrastructure is done by lots of people in this community. Do you discuss public infrastructure, or are you looking at private infrastructure? I am always very reluctant, I'm just gonna say this, to ask the schools and the county to participate in something that we haven't talked to them about in a way that they feel like they're a partner. So if we're gonna talk about, some of the other plans, we can give information on CARPO, because that's basically a state law that it's just a process. It's about weighting scores. CARPO is all about scores. And it's not about where it is, it's just how they score the project often. So I think that there's a lot of emphasis on this I think we have to figure out, and I think suggested were the idea of extending the time of the meeting, having a facilitator that has some skill set on infrastructure, and then deciding how you do the interconnections or the definition of what infrastructure is for this community. Maybe, and that can extend beyond, but I just think it's a focus that we all have to work within. So Ms. Watlington wants to be recognized? Yes.
Yeah, so I feel like infrastructure can be a big thing, right? But if we go back to the whole reason this meeting was called in the first place, it came out of zoning. How are we looking at the broader picture in order to make sure that as we're approving rezonings, we're not making things worse? So to me, rather than backing all the way up and trying to create a brand new strategy, why not just work from what was shared with us last week? Show us the projects. Show us, based on the criteria that was shared with us last week, that's supposed to take all of our Comp 2040 goals into account. Show us how places were scored. Where are the intersections? That, to me, was a great start. I don't see what valuable other thing we could be doing at this point besides looking at the actual intersections and looking at the projects to improve those intersections, how much it's gonna cost, do we have a way to pay for it? And if we do, great, well, let's prioritize it. If we don't, where are we gonna get it, and what are we gonna do in the meantime? That, to me, is the only outcome that would address the initial need for this meeting in the first place. And then that bleeds very nicely into every other form of infrastructure, which should already be baked into those projects, because you don't just have transportation projects, you've got all kinds of stormwater projects and everything else, right? That's the infrastructure that we have. How does that line up with schools? That consistently shows up on the rezoning. That's an obvious overlay. As we talk about planning for transportation, those roads are going into other counties and the people riding on them are going across the county line. That's clearly a partnership opportunity. So perhaps that doesn't happen in the first phase, but if nothing else, to me, the obvious next answer is to put our eyes on a map at the intersections. What are the projects? How much do they cost? Then we can talk about what the strategy is for places where we've got funding and we've got a need. What's the strategy for places where we have a need and no funding? And I'll conclude my remarks.
Thank you. All right. Mayor Pro Tem? Mr. Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Only thing I would add, and I agree with Councilman Anderson, maybe not the first meeting, but maybe the second or third meeting, we talk about invite partners. And one partner I think we definitely have at the table as related to transportation is HNTB. They're leading kind of an expert in that field. They've done some of our projects, so to have that expertise to help address some of the transportation, I think is one partner we need to have on our short invitation list. And city manager, then I think there's other partners you know have worked with us, so I'll be glad to kind of hear your recommendation as well, having that voice at the table. Mayor, let me just throw out kind of an obvious, just reading body language around here, around the table. We got 3 people we have signed to do this, and I'm confident in their leadership that we give them feedback and maybe let them work on the agenda to come before us December 12th. When is our next council meeting? Okay, I did get it right, okay. And then maybe we could spend more time, because I think if we tried to solve this today, we would be here to 1 o'clock in the morning. I will order another pizza, and we all would be tired. So I hope we get to the.
understand, yeah,
You know, yeah.
that's true. So those were excellent comments, Mr. Mitchell. City Manager?
So, thank you, Mayor, members of council. The Mayor Pro Tem was trying to be helpful to staff to see if we could have direction before we left tonight. I will say I appreciate what you said, Councilmember Mitchell, and if the 3 individuals are willing to just pull me in or something like that, I would be more than willing to help pull something together.
All right. Ms. Mayfield has a question.
It's a clarifying question, because I kind of, and maybe I missed it. It seemed like what Councilmember Wallington laid out was that direction for the manager. As far as if we need a outline to get started, as was mentioned, they are the 3 individuals that's working on this and leading it. If we go back to the why we even got here and incorporate, you all now have all the information, staff has been capturing all the notes throughout the day, and figure out from there where were the 3, 4 items that were a consensus between all of us, but using the framework that was just laid out by Councilwoman Wallington, so that we don't have to keep rehashing this, we can move forward. It seemed like a direction was recommended, and now for the 3 to go back and pull all this information that staff has been collecting together for the day. And just for clarification, Councilmember Watlington, did I miss? No, you got it. Just wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Well, I definitely heard Ms. Watlington suggest a way, but I also heard Ms. Anderson suggest a way that was different. I've heard a couple different suggestions here. The intent for today was, yes, was to allow for the 3 of us to go back with staff to hear this full council conversation. But unless I'm not hearing things right, we have a bunch of fragmented ideas, but we really don't have a majority of council kind of guiding where this thing should go. We have a couple different pieces. Some people have, 2 or 3 of us have agreed with certain parts and directions, but we haven't gotten a clear direction of expected outcomes by the full council. And I think that's where we need to get. I think we need to stay here as long as we need to make that happen. But unless I'm hearing something different, if staff thinks that they have what they need for us to kind of go forward and do some work, I'll stand corrected, I guess.
I mean, if straw votes help to give some direction, then let's do it. I mean, I also would be interested to hear what Mr. Bakari has. I know that 3 of y'all were working on this. Was there anything that you, based on what you're hearing here, sounds like the direction that y'all were thinking?
I think she asked you, and is no objection to answering that question. If it's
So, the 3 of us worked over the weekend on this, having been asked to focus on it. And I'll tell you, this meeting on the 19th, while there's a lot of ways you can do it, if it's something where this group goes around in a free form and has conversations on things they think are priorities, or there's some external facilitator in there, or some external partners are coming in, that meeting is not for me, and I will not be in attendance. This meeting was designed to be something very simple, and it was meant to have a 2-week sprint by staff, essentially come in and take infrastructure as a word and as a topic, and break it down into a taxonomy of subcategories. And that's what we were all supposed to do today in committee meetings. say, what are those subcategories? In our meeting at budget and governance and the other words, we said school capacity. That is, these are things that a good barometer is, do they ever come up on zoning nights where people are frustrated with a rezoning petition or density, citing that as lacking? So we would come, the staff on the 19th would come and list and say, here is our list that we've worked up directionally, a skeleton of the subcategories of infrastructure, our skeleton-based approach of here's how we are going to collect the data to then show each one of those points and ultimately measure them. And here's the process and timeline that we're going to go. And it's just meant to be us getting presented by staff, and whether it's water, sewer, stormwater, roads, sidewalks, school capacity, greenways, lights, crime stats, so today, hopefully they got some things that are a start of our view. It's not meant to be guiding them, it's meant to help kickstart them. They would go work for the next 2 weeks, then come back to us on that day and basically say, here's the plan over the next X months that we're gonna build, which is gonna show you your infrastructure position, your heat map. And it's gonna say, here are your subcategories, here are the data points, the overlays of the map, and here are the measurements that kind of is like a volume to capacity ratio, fail, pass, where we are, ultimately getting us to 2 points. One, how much money would it cost for us to solve it all across the board? If we wanted to invest in it all, we used to have a number with volume to capacity ratio, which said if we solved all this, it would cost this, but then we would be passing at all of our major corridors. We need that across the board, across every portion of town for all those metrics. And then we have our big meeting. And our big meeting is not transactionally, can we do this here or that there? It's policy-based. And it says, here's how we're going to approach X, Y, Z in the infrastructure list. And it brings infrastructure up to the level it should be in this community, which is, we just spent 2 years more dumping gasoline on growth with the UDO, with the comp plan. Now we're gonna do the same thing with our job to keep up with, that's infrastructure. So I think the 19th meeting is really, really simple. It's staff's work as a touch point to say, here's the plan we're gonna be building, here's how long it's gonna take. It's the taxonomy of subcategories, it's the data, it's the measurements around that, and then it's the process by which that's gonna come back to us overall. So I don't think we have to solve anything. We have to react to what staff has there and say if we like it or don't, and then that's when they keep going forward, and I think we have multiple touch points like that.
Ms. Mayfield?
This question, thank you, Madam Mayor. This question is actually for staff. Based, listening to what Councilmember Bakari just went over, do you all have what you need from the conversations that we had earlier today in order to go into the next step? If the next step was the expectation that staff then is supposed to bring it all together and bring it back to us to say, here's what's been identified, here's some opportunities that we're thinking about to achieve it.
I'll start by saying thank you, Councilmember Mayfield. I love the approach. It's kind of where we started last week with Ed. We were supposed to do that by summer. I pushed it up into the first quarter of the next calendar year.
At one point, though, Mr. Manager, what we did with Ed, while there were some parts that touched to this, I'm not referring to projects, right? Projects and all that stuff, that's kind of what we're doing already. What we're looking for is a state of infrastructure across the board, right? Where are we now? Where are the gaps, basically?
I'm with you. I'm trying to get to a point where we don't under-deliver.
Right.
Okay? So I wish Angela were here. So, and Liz, so I believe that we can give you some information along those lines about what we have. So for instance, we struggle as a organization, as a team, when we give you how many miles of sidewalks that we have that are not funded. There's no way in the world that the city would fund all of those sidewalks because you have developers that are going to be a part of it. So I guess what I'm saying is, I think that is the way to approach this. I'm trying to figure out how to do it in such a way that you don't get a number of data points and you say, we wasted our time.
I think that, if I could, following up on Mr. Bakari's point, is that he said fail, pass. One of the real challenges we have is how do we actually know how we put something on a list right now? And whether or not that list is current, is it a list that's, or the criteria within the list works for us, or works for the 2040 plan. And so I think if you had just fail, pass, review, and examine, that leads you to the policy discussion, because much of this is about, you know, this is where development occurs, this is the number of square feet we're gonna do, the number of miles of road and asphalt, all of that. But do we all believe in the criteria that we've established? And if you identify it as fail, pass, then there's some ability to have notes. So I just wonder if it's, I see where Mr. Bakari is going, because I do believe that hotspots have been around in our city since the 1970s, and we haven't dealt with them. But that in itself is a fact, and a fact that we kind of could ask that question. Is this part of what happened in our development, that when we were focusing on economic development, we didn't do this? How long has it been? That kind of conversation, and if you look at the major buckets, I can't remember who said buckets. I think Ms. Johnson said buckets, or maybe Mayor Pro Tem. The buckets are transportation, actually in stormwater, water and sewer together. These big buckets could have kind of an assessment of, are we doing things the best way now, or under the right metrics now?
To that point,
Can I go real quick to that, because I think this is important. I think the pass-fail thing is, it's not the destination, but it's an easy tool along the way, much like volume to capacity ratio, to, once we set a policy, be able to look at the whole city and see where we're failing, right? And where it has to be at a minimum. And if you think about, like, if you go like failing, average, acceptable, the broader point of all this is, on a rezoning night, if once we've finished this whole exercise and we've gotten everything, let's say, to acceptable, if somebody comes in and says, no, I don't want that rezoning there because of X, Y, and Z, and we look at it and it's acceptable, we say, well, either that's wrong, this is good and where you want it, or we need to revisit our overall policy and up the bar even more. It doesn't become a transactional discussion with them.
Right.
So the pass-fail thing is just one. I'd mention all those subcategories, sub-buckets underneath there. Obviously, roads is a huge one. Now, we've got a whole other focus on roads. So that's gonna be hit in that bucket as that work continues. But there's a ton of other topics and categories underneath there. And I just think that once we have all that laid out in front of us, it's gonna be a really powerful tool to be able to kind of understand where we need to start putting investments and making policy decisions.
I'm sorry, I have to say this, because there's clearly, for me, a disconnect between what we saw last week and what we're talking about today. As an engineer, my expectation is by the time I see a project, it's because you've already done this work in some capacity, because otherwise, how did you define what the project list was gonna be in the first place? So why wouldn't what we saw already be the culmination of that work? What I'm concerned about is that we go back to zero and have a conversation about creating something that should already be feeding the input into what's in the budget today.
I think here's the problem with that. Theoretically, they should have a bunch of stuff they've already done to put in this format. And maybe it's a matter of it just hasn't been done like that, or it hasn't been communicated to us. I don't know which one. But the reason I know this works is I have done a mini version of it, or in the middle of doing it in Cotswold.
Well, I'm not saying it doesn't work. What I'm saying is that should already be done.
I think
That's
you
what
might
we
be.
saw last
I'm not
week.
trying to say people aren't doing their job. I'm saying this is a new lens that hasn't been requested to be looked at before, and I'm not convinced it wasn't there for me in Cotswold.
So
as
this
I
that we
went through and
saw
tried to
last
get my
week,
hands
we
on
had
it.
this new
Unfortunately-
criteria. was that not the new lands? That, to me, looked like what was being sold was that it came straight from the 2040 plan.
Right, so the new lens that has just been approved, just is being developed, is very different than the 4 criteria for the last 20 years.
Oh,
that we've been going.
absolutely, absolutely.
So we just tried to give you the first glimpse of how we're going to move forward with these new 8 criteria. One thing that I hope can get us to a good place is that I just checked in with the team. Water, stormwater, transportation, and fire infrastructure. We believe that we could give you something around those areas, those 4, for you to have a good discussion on the 19th.
Okay.
But even if, I think my point is, build the whole skeleton. It can be 0% done. We need to directionally respond to, did you get the entire universe of scope included in the plan, not do you have the answers on the 19th?
I like that, and I think, I know we can do that. The question is the answers piece.
No one would expect you to have these answers. The point is, wouldn't you rather hear us react
Correct.
to see if there were 6 or more votes that wanted to include this versus didn't care, and you wouldn't burn your time on it? I think that's the premise.
All right, Ms. Johnson and Ms. Molina.
One example that I think about, so, and this comes from a zoning perspective. Mallard Creek quadrant, right now, we have pending developments that total 18,000 trips or more. There's, just down the street, there's the King's Grant development. I think it's 1 million square feet. We know there's this cumulative impact, but where do we see this as council? We know there's an impact on the schools. We know that these are state-owned roads that aren't going to be improved for a long time. But yet we could have a rezoning petition next month that would not take into account any of that other growth. So that's what we need as council. We need some type of, and I'd like to see like a map with overlays. You know, the traffic, the infrastructure. We know all this growth is impacting the quality of our pipes. Where is that a problem? So we just need some type of visual aid or policy or cumulative policy that helps us make responsible decisions instead of a siloed approach. So I don't know if that's when Mr. Bakari talked about a skeleton, if we had something with all of those buckets. You know, I've asked the question about wildlife displacement, trees, environment. All of these areas are impacted by our decisions. So we need to some kind of way, some kind of tool from your magic toolbox that you have, you know, just some kind of tool that we are able to see this. And I don't know what that is. If we can get a snapshot of the current status, the state of the infrastructure, I like that, right? The state of the infrastructure, but we need to know which areas that we really need to perhaps consider if that's an appropriate place for development, or are there other areas where we need to be looking at development, but we really need an overview of where we are in the city as far as the infrastructure. And I don't just mean you know, the pipes and everything, but the impact of the growth. Thank you.
Ms. Molina?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I've listened to all of my colleagues, and I think I've heard the conversation go from expansive to more dignified to a more expansive conversation. I just want to note a few things. First, when Councilmember Bakari was speaking, it was something that resonated to me, because when I think infrastructure, very similarly to a little bit of what Ms. Johnson just said, I think about what we look at in a zoning meeting on a Monday night when we're about to potentially approve a project. What's there, what's available to us. And I think in my 1 or 2 comments that I made during committee today, I started to speak about something that many of my colleagues have already mentioned. So to not be redundant, I would like to say that, there's so many different overlaps. Like everyone has said, there's transportation. There are the things that are within our purview, and then there are also those additional metrics that are outside of our reach and our purview. As we've said, county, state, federal, et cetera. I think what I heard today from our staff, however, was the beginning of some resolutions that I was very excited about, and I want to mention that part. They actually presented a funding and zoning integration idea to kind of get that ball rolling on, where we can actually, because, I think it's very important to let our public know when people hear us say the decisions we make, they think that we're doing a complete project ourselves. And I think I heard Sean Heath say we're like 1 to 5, it's like a 1 to 5 ratio, or 5 to 1, where the actual development community is participating at a 5%, we're participating at 1%, in relatively, relative to what the impact is for funds when there is any type of infrastructure project. And so one of the things I suggested also in committee today was that we are, and not that this meeting would facilitate that, but maybe in the future, I think something that we have to consider is what voices from the development community do we have at the table. We need something that really, because I think sometimes it's like speaking 2 or 3 languages. We have our deliverables as a council because we are responsible to the people that we serve, and their voices are really what inform what we say and do at the dais. And then we have, of course, the city that can have a competing deliverable, and we try to meet at the middle. But then you also introduce this outlier of a deliverable where, the development community have what they would like to see happen. And a lot of the times there's a different, set of, there's a different baseline, there's a different outcome intended, there's so many different, there's just this array of expectation. And so I feel like at some point in this process, we have to get those 3 voices in a room so that we understand what the 3 can do together. And considering, not to say that they outweigh what we do because they come with more money. Obviously, it's the decision of the dais that informs what they're able to do. But I think development, city, and this particular governing body have to work together in order to make this something that's more feasible. But what I heard from Sean Heath and his team today, like I said, I just want to definitely lift that up, is that they were talking about layering the housing trust fund, where it actually impacted different, measurements of need from our community, economic mobility, jobs, childcare, transportation, and actually allowing developers that intended to make those items a priority, more of an impact or more of a, more access to them and try. I think that's what I would like to see also. But just, I'm going off pace. I'm coming back to say that, I feel like that everyone, because we represent very diverse parts of Charlotte, and what informs our opinion in many cases are the people that we serve, right? Like I heard Councilmember Bakari talk about the project on Cotswold, right? That's a very unique project, and I know because his people were contacting most of us as well, that they are unique in what their expectations are. And so I said all that to say that I think somehow, I heard CARPO, which I'm, wanting to become more familiar with, a volume to capacity ratio metric, where we can actually bring those competing deliverables in some type of, metric opportunity where we can see what that potential impact is so that we can better speak to the people that we serve when we make a decision. So, like I said, just in summary, to sum up what I said, I think today in committee, in the 2 committees that I participated in, one in particular, when we were in our housing meeting, I heard Sean Heath bring with his team some very good ideas to get us started in our thought processes around how we streamline this process and the opportunities going forward. And then I would also, anytime that you inform policy, policy has to be something that you do irregardless of what type of infrastructure project we're talking. It don't matter what kind of infrastructure we're talking about. If it's a policy, it is implementable across the board, right? So I don't think we think of policy in isolation. Policy is something that is going to make these three, items better. It doesn't matter the type of process we're talking about. Policy is absolutely, it has nothing to do with any of that. And so examples are important because that's going to inform how we create the policy, but the policy has to be implemented whether we're talking about small project, public, private entity, it does not matter. A policy is uninformed by specificity in that way.
Okay. Mr. Jones, do you have enough to work from this with the 3 council members that are participating in this effort?
No, I feel comfortable.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Said it best, though, the first meeting, we're not gonna solve the problems. So let's get to the first meeting with low expectations, but committed and intentional to do something great at the end.
Like I said, that if you can have if you can do the first meeting, we did make a decision that there would be some facilitation. I think that's really good. I think that the remainder of it has been the idea of, let's at least understand and talk from the same language. If we do that in the first meeting.
Just to say it real crisply, if we're on this page, because I think this is where a lot of confusion was, there's no expectations for this council to solve any problems. We're gonna come in there and we're gonna react to what staff is putting in a framework and a skeleton and a go-forward plan that they're gonna work on for months, and we're gonna have an initial reaction, it'll be one of many, and that's literally it.
Okay. I think Ms. Sajmira?
Yeah, microphone.
If you could just get us the pre-read material at least 2 to 3 days in advance, so that everyone has an opportunity to read. Thank you. And there was
I don't know
once-
what pre-reading, I just want to, I'm trying to be really clear. What are the pre-reading plans that would be?
So there were a number of requests that were made. The first request came from our committee that Ms. Mayfield had requested, visuals and maps on key infrastructure investments over the past 5 years, and what's planned in the future. And if that priority needs to be changed based on the feedback from the council. But that was one of the requests that was made. I'm sure there were other requests from the committees, but I just want to make sure that if we can get some of this ahead of time.
I think that's what I want to be clear on. If those requests were made and we're going in this direction, how does that work? So Mayor Pro Tem?
Well, yeah, it's Ms. Ashmira's question. I will get with staff. I sat in every committee meeting, and there were multiple requests, some which were similar, some which were very different. There were requests by individual council members, by themselves, so we will work with staff to determine, what is, how to best provide council with the data that they think that they need.
I really feel like this needs to be a step 2.
Yes.
Because what the task we've given staff is all on their shoulders. It's gonna take everything in their power to bring us something robust enough to react to, even at a level. So if we can all agree, like, we're gonna need that information, but the first thing is, what are you gonna do? So bring us the skeleton of what you're gonna do. Let us react, spend all your time for 2 weeks on that, and then we won't lose. We'll compile all those things and let them do it. But I don't think they can do both.
And I think that's an important thing. I don't want to have an expectation that people have that's not going to work or requires a modification one way or the other. So I think that specifically,
Mr. Jones, could you react to that? I just want to hear from you directly and not have others speak on your behalf.
So, thank you.
Excuse me?
No, I'm talking about Mr. Bukhari because he said you need to do both. You need to do either X or Y.
I'm prepared to speak on anyone's behalf.
my
I just want to make
question
sure
was
that.
to make sure we're clear on it. So Mr. Jones?
So I did think we were headed in a different pathway, And I thought the different pathway was related to those 4 areas: transportation, stormwater, water, and we would do fire infrastructure. And that would be the beginning of how we could compile this data. I'll give you an example. A lot of times we do talk about water and stormwater, but it's a rate. I don't think in the 6 years I've been here that we've really had a robust infrastructure discussion about water and stormwater. So we'll be talking more about projects and things of that nature. So we've asked for a lot of grace. It would be helpful if we could lock into that, keep a list of all of the other questions that have been asked tonight, and work really hard for 2 weeks, which is really less than 2 weeks, because we're going to have to get you something by maybe the Friday before to get these done. But I will tell you, we'll keep the list, and if there's some things that are so easy to do, we'll just start shooting them out to you, in your packets, or maybe even as a part of this, if that works for council.
Madam Mayor.
Does that work, Ms. Anderson?
So,
And then Mr. Graham, we're just trying to figure out if what the manager said works. Okay?
Yep.
Mayor Pro Tem, Ms. Anderson?
So, Mr. Jones, can I make a suggestion? Would it be possible that at next Monday, when we have our meeting, if you can provide a tentative agenda for this 19th meeting, or maybe it's Mayor Pro Tem, but can we see a tentative agenda next week of the meeting in the flow, so we can all get consensus before we actually execute on the 19th?
I think that's fine. I think we should give it to you before the 19th, before the 12th.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
so that maybe the next 2 days, if we can just get an agenda
Yeah.
that you agree upon, and that way we can continue to do the work, but you'll have an agenda
That would be excellent, yeah.
By the 12th.
before the 12th.
He's saying they could do it within the next few days. I was trying to give you some time. I didn't want to
Okay,
put pressure on you, but yeah, I think that would be great. And then everyone can be bought in before we actually begin to have pre-requests and everything else, because we'll know what we're actually focused on that day.
That's a great idea.
You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Okay.
So this, yeah, I got you. Okay, so I just want to make sure that we're clear. What Mr. Jones said is that if we can get questions, he can send that out with the meeting agenda, the questions that have been addressed, if that's feasible, but he may not be able to get everything done considering the work that's going to be done around the research for the meeting. All right, so I want to make sure Mr. Graham is next, but please, I want you to give me some consensus on that decision. And I just want you to say heads up, thumbs up, that that's okay? I see nodding of heads.
Well,
All right? Okay. Okay. All right, thank you. It's important because you made a specific request about the overlays and all of that. So right now, we'll try to do as much and get as much out, but if it's not feasible with all the other work, we'll continue to work toward it.
I trust the 3 that were identified to lead this conversation.
All right? Thank you. Mr. Graham?
No, that would be really helpful. And again, the manager laid out a calendar of 2 to 3 months. So a number of the requests that we heard today could be responded to within that period. And again, we're going to be doing this for a while.
Right. Okay. Any other items to come before from the overall on the general idea of where we're heading on infrastructure? A lot of hard work, and it's difficult conversations, but we're really glad that we've come to this conclusion. So we're ready to move to the committee reports now. I think you guys did more than infrastructure today, I expect. So why don't we start with Mr. Graham? If there's anything of note, it's not required, but I think that the idea was if there are questions in the committee moving forward that the council as a whole need to address and answer, that's what you want to get out on the table. It's not a report of everything. It's just what do you need to engage the council in to give you guidance and thoughts comments?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Mayor. The other agenda item we had, and there were only two on today's meeting, was the quarters of opportunity, and the staff did an amazing job today in terms of, one, giving us a year in review of all the work that they've done in the various quarters throughout the city, gave us a perspective in terms of where we're headed for 2023, and a lot of great conversations. You should be receiving your package probably within the next week and a half, the year in review for the quarters of opportunity. But again, great meeting, great presentations. A lot of work are being done in the quarters, and that'll be reflective in the annual report that you receive within the next week or two. Thank you.
Want guidance, advice, comments, cajoling, laughter? From your report, your committee report.
Yep, two things. Be thinking about Housing Trust Fund tune-ups and tools. If you didn't have an opportunity to tune into the meeting, take a moment to look, or at the very least, avail yourself of some information regarding the Westside Community Land Trust. They are doing a phenomenal job. What they're doing lines up very nicely with what staff presented today in terms of options for the Housing Trust Fund. And I'd like to support them, and I'll just go ahead and go on record and say that they will be making an ask, and I think that it is absolutely in line with what we'd like to do. Heads up, we've got $75 million remaining for housing, 21 in housing, 21 in ARPA, 50 in Housing Trust Fund, right, racks on racks on racks. 21 in ARPA, 50 in Housing Trust Fund, and $4 million in PAYGO. So let's spend some money out. Looking forward to the Housing and Job Summit.
Okay.
I didn't know that's what
That's
that
just
meant.
another reminder that the 28th is the Housing and Jobs Fund and how to connect those two for upward mobility. I had a great conversation with Sherry, who's now leading the Leading on Opportunity, and they are aligning their metrics and achievements citywide with these kinds of efforts that are more sustainable in terms of addressing the mobility of generations, generational change. So, yes.
What's happening December 28th?
Isn't that the date that the Housing and Jobs Program Fund is? Which is it? I'm sorry, I may have the date wrong.
Okay.
It's not 9th and 10th.
Okay.
Oh my gosh, the 28th. What was on the 28th? Something was.
Okay.
My birthday or something like that. Okay. The next report we'll have is from Ms. Ajmira.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So we had 3 additional items in addition to the infrastructure discussion. So the second item we had on our agenda was external auditor. It's an important part of what we do. We had a clean opinion. That's the highest level of opinion we can have on our financial statements by an external auditor. Certainly, that's something to celebrate. That speaks a volume of our accounting leadership that we have, and our CFO, Ms. Teresa Smith. So we had an external auditor from Cherry Baker who did present us. So that means really no difficulties working with staff, no illegal acts, no fraud, no inappropriate accounting practices or policies. There was one material weakness that was identified, and the primary reason for the material weakness was the correction of the market value from June 30, 2022. And that was driven by an incomplete new report that was not caught by staff. So there is a new process in place by CFO Smith, indicated a plan to correct this in future. So this will be an internal review process quarterly rather than annual process. And I know Councilmember Anderson asked about that, and she felt comfortable having this quarterly process. We'll certainly catch this if that ever happens in future. So the Local Government Commission requires that we sign a letter by a majority of the council to be submitted to the Local Government Commission of today's presentation. So I know that CFO Smith has the letter for signature, and all the committee members unanimously approved that. There were no objections. That's in a nutshell. So if you could sign on to that letter, we do have a deadline of February 5th. And Ms. Mayfield asked a very good question, if there was any liability that you're incurring as a result of signing on to that letter. And I'd let Mr. Baker respond to that, but from what I understood, there was no liability. You could just ask Mr. Baker directly, but Mr. Baker can ultimately sign on behalf of the council, if you all agree to that. So, Mr. Baker, if you could just, if you want to add anything to that?
What the report says, excuse me, and then I would sign that on your behalf.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so any questions, concerns on the auditor's report?
Any questions, concerns? None?
Okay. The third item we had was the governance recommendations. This was something that was carried on from the previous council. So there were two items. One was the 4-year term, and second was adding an 8th district. So committee heard a presentation from Amy Peacock, who's chaired our Citizens Committee on Governance a couple of years ago. And the committee also got a presentation from our attorney. And we looked at the previous recommendations on both items, and there were several questions that committee members had, especially the new members, Mr. Mitchell, Ms. Mayfield, and Ms. Anderson. So the motion was passed to talk about that item and to be deferred to our January's meeting. So we'll bring recommendations at our January strategy meeting. Okay. Any questions on those two items? Okay. All right, and the last item we had was the legislative strategy. Mr. Dana Fenton had presented both federal and state legislative items. The federal side included Destination CLT, 2030 Transit Corridor System Plan, Immigration, Sustainability, and Resilience. So you can see the overall theme here is infrastructure-related investments. And the state side was also mobility, state transportation funds, and Safe Charlotte. So as you can see, we continue to focus on infrastructure. The committee will discuss this agenda item at our next meeting before it comes to the full council for feedback. But that's all I have. Committee members, anything else? Anything I missed? Feel free to add.
Great job, Mr. Chair.
So, did I understand that we got a clean audit opinion? I'd just like to pause for a moment and reflect on that. That's a big deal, okay? Our books were looked at, our financial management was found to be sound,
Yes.
and therefore I believe congratulations are due to the manager and the finance staff.
Right.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, you didn't screw up.
Okay. So now we'll go to tap from Mr. Driggs. Anything from your committee discussion?
I will just mention briefly, we got a report on the UDO work process going forward. The translation is being done. I think everybody needs to just understand this. We're doing the translation right now of the zoning categories. They will become effective on the effective date next year. And then the alignment process starts, which is another look at those in the context of our 2040 plan and our policy map. At the same time, area plans are going to get developed. So the entire city is broken up into 14, I believe, areas, and plans will be developed for those as well. The goal is to get all of that done in a couple of years, which I think is very ambitious. But Ms. Craig pointed out that because of all the work we've done on the UDO and the kind of groundwork that we've laid for it, it's not an unreasonable target. The other thing we talked about was the Silver Line alignment. And again, here we have a conversation going on right now about the locally preferred alignment, one that runs along Trade Street and the Gold Line, and the other that runs along the Blue Line. We got some feedback on the outreach that staff had conducted to try to get public opinion about this. And essentially, on the basis of the public opinion that they received, it looked like the Blue Line alignment was inferior, not very good responses there. So then it came down to a comparison between the locally preferred alignment and Trade Street, the Gold Line. After hearing discussion about cost and a whole bunch of other factors, the committee decided that as far as we were concerned, the locally preferred alignment looked like the better one, and we voted, I believe, 4-1 to that effect. It's not really a recommendation or anything, but just in committee, we felt the locally preferred alignment looked like the better answer. More work going on that, and Ms. Anderson, I think you were the dissenting vote, so if you'd care to comment, feel free, but, I mean, if you don't, that's fine too, but.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Driggs. So my perspective was, and of course, Mr. Driggs and I chair and vice chair of this committee, so we have a lot of meetings with staff and outside partners to provide input for these decisions, and so I'm scrubbed in pretty well to it. My perspective is there was a decision that was made by a previous council for the preferred offering, and there were two options that have risen in addition to that, and there's many compelling reasons why those two options have rose to the surface, and so I would prefer that we continue down the path of listening to the public as it relates to those other two options, and make a sound decision about how this will impact the future of the city, and not focus our discussion around the disturbance that this construction will have in our city. Either option is going to bring construction and disturbance, but what would be the best option for the city of Charlotte on the outside of it, and continue to get the input from the public. So that's why I couldn't be fully aligned with it, but of course I will, as I did, will go with the position of the committee.
So colleagues, I just wanted to point out, this is coming up next month, right? So I would encourage you all to kind of look at it and so you don't feel jammed by it. They are doing more work on it. We will get more information, but it is I think that there should be council support for whatever is proposed there.
Ms. Ajmera? Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, Mr. Jones, we all got a map of all those options, and at least I will speak for me, for myself. I will need some sort of briefing as to pros and cons for each option. I'm not clear on that just from looking at the map. So if we can have, I mean, this is a very important decision that council will be making. I just want to make sure that we all understand pros and cons for each one. Obviously, I appreciate the work that committee has done, and I certainly will look to their recommendation, but I think it's equally important for each council to understand, each council member to understand benefits and disadvantages for each option. And I would like to see, I know during our discussion I had asked, or even at the last strategy meeting, what I'd like to see, and maybe that was already presented, was the economic impact, ridership numbers, and the cost for each one of this option. I'm sure that information is probably available, but I think that will certainly help.
If I may, if you just look on the website for the committee, the slides that we saw today had a lot of that in them, right? So there were 3 columns, pros, cons, there was some money information. So you'd get a lot closer just from looking at that.
So is this something that's been added to our, one of our dinner briefings?
So, thank you, Councilmember Ashmere. Let me talk a little bit about the process. So this is kind of interesting. So this LPA, or the Local Preferred Alternative, is something that had been worked on for a while. We had a very robust conversation in this room a few years ago when we had to get $50 million in order to have the design for the Silver Line done. I guess sometime during the pandemic, there was a question about the alignment, and there was a ULI study. And based on the ULI study, another alignment came about as well as a third alignment that came in internally. So to your question, I just wanted to give a little bit of level set for some of the other council members. There will be 5 criteria. Some of the criteria, as Councilmember Driggs said, we've already started to populate some numbers. But before there's any decision that you'll make, we'll get all of that information provided to you through the committee. I believe we're coming back in January with the committee. And I believe there's an MTC vote at the end of January. And so we'll get information to you. Again, I think that the council endorsing an alignment, which is somewhat what the committee did today, is something that the MTC would want to know, but ultimately they will make a decision about what the alignment is.
Mr. Manager, I just point out this is a big deal, so I hope that everybody on council will have the opportunity to express an opinion if they want to. Thank you.
It's an even bigger deal for the towns in the south. It goes to Central Piedmont's campus right outside of Matthews. And as most of us can see, if we had a hot map for development in Huntersville and Matthews, it'd be fiery. And so I think the idea is that those communities are really trying hard to figure out mobility at a time when the state isn't doing anything for state roads in those communities as well, and they don't have the capacity necessarily to address some of the other things that they would like to see in terms of mobility. So it's an important decision for them as well. John Higdon is the mayor of Matthews. If you want to have a conversation with him, I think he would appreciate that. And I know that there are other people that are serving on their council that would also be helpful for them. Okay? They've already endorsed the LPA. Matthews has already endorsed it. Yes. Okay, that's the final of our committee reports, final of the discussion on infrastructure. It's now, Mr. Mitchell?
If I may, Madam Mayor, something that's been kind of frustrating to me is just not having a conversation about CMPD. You know, I think we got sworn in September 6th, and now here we are in December, and it seems as we have not had any kind of discussion around the police and what they're doing and some of the issues they're facing. So if we could, maybe at a dinner briefing in January, tee up kind of the state of CMPD, I think would be helpful.
I was going to ask you, how would you frame it? It's the state of CMPD
Yes,
from the
ma'am.
chief? That sounds like if we can make that happen with the other meetings.
And the response times, I think that's scheduled for next Monday.
Correct.
Tee it up in January.
So response times will be first, but the state of CMPD will be a separate, right? Okay? Mr. Jones, anything else?
Just one quick point. There was just an injury. Everything's okay, but for Miss Mayfield, I just wanted you to know that it was peekaboo-related injury, and that he's in the ICU now.
Okay, all right, from that, we are adjourned. I mean, when peekaboo's starting to come out, oh my God.
She can't handle dad jokes. Look, every time you say a dad joke to
Oh
Alana,
my gosh,
she just looks.
no.